Brand and Content Officer here at 6th and I. Whether you're here with us in person or watching virtually from home, on behalf of 6th and I and our partner, Politics and Prose, thank you so much for being with us tonight and for your support of a nonprofit and an independent bookstore. This is an exciting time for 6th and I and Politics and Prose because we're both celebrating milestone anniversaries, 20 years for 6th and I and 40 years for Politics and Prose. Yeah, thank you. There are a few ways that you can help us celebrate. Here at 6th and I, during the month of April, if you donate $20 for 20 years, you'll be entered into a drawing to win 20 tickets to use at 6th and I events over the next year. There are QR codes on the back of the pews that you can scan to make a donation easily, and we thank you so much. And to help Politics and Prose celebrate, you can, of course, buy lots of books from them, now and always, and also attend their 40th anniversary celebration on June 22nd, which will be a full day of festivities at their Connecticut Avenue store location. It's my honor to introduce the Nobel Prize-winning economist, Dr. Joseph E. Stiglitz. Dr. Stiglitz was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Clinton, chief economist of the World Bank, and has been named by Time as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. He now teaches at Columbia University and is chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. Dr. Stiglitz helped create a new branch of economics, the economics of information, which explores the consequences of information asymmetries. He pioneered pivotal concepts such as adverse selection and moral hazard, which have now become standard tools not only of theorists, but also of policy analysts. Dr. Stiglitz builds on his contributions to the theories of welfare economics and of income and wealth distribution with his latest book, which brings us together tonight, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. In it, he dissects America's current economic system and the political ideology that created it. He considers with care what to do when one person's freedom conflicts with another's, when the goal is to create a society in which everyone can flourish. Tonight, he will be in conversation with Timothy Noah, a staff writer for The New Republic and a contributing editor of The Washington Monthly. He is the author of The Great Divergence, America's Growing Inequality Crisis and What We Can Do About It, and he currently writes the Substack newsletter Backbencher. Later in the program, we'd love to hear your questions, and you can line up at the standing microphones in either aisle. Thank you all again, both here and at home, for joining us. Please help me give Dr. Joseph Stiglitz and Timothy Noah a warm welcome to 6th and I.
Well, it's a delight to be here with you today. Joe and I actually did, this is we're reteaming. We did an event 12 years ago. We were discussing in the green room on income inequality. So it's a pleasure now to be talking to you about your latest book. And it's a book about freedom. And I guess my first question for you is your choice of freedom as a subject. It's economic. The concept of economic freedom, most of us would associate with conservatives and with the idea of laissez-faire. I think most liberals' notion of economic freedom is encapsulated by that great philosopher Janis Joplin when she said, "Freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose." You have a different view, but can you tell me what made you decide to write a book on the subject of freedom?
Well, it was partly because the term had been captured by the right. Mm-hmm. And when I thought about Milton Friedman writing a book, Capitalism and Freedom, or Hayek writing a book called The Road to Serfdom, which is really about how if you had too large of a state, you would wind up on the road to authoritarianism. They were writing about freedom and the relationship between, quote, free enterprise and political freedom. And I just thought they had gotten it so wrong. And they had so much influence in the policy dialogue. And unfortunately, not only in the dialogue, in the policies, the laws, the legal framework that we had. So in a way, the predominant economic doctrine in the last 40 years has been neoliberalism, which is, neo means new, liberalism is free, and it was about freeing banks to do whatever they wanted, freeing firms to do whatever they wanted. And I thought that set of ideas was really what had brought us to the current set of problems, the inequality that you and I both have written about, the slowing of economic growth, and to our political problems, which in turn are undermining our economy.
On the first page of the book, you quote Isaiah Berlin, and actually this afternoon you sent me back to, I pulled down a dusty copy of Isaiah Berlin's 4 essays on liberty, and discovered that his views on liberty were actually much more complex than I remembered. He's known as the guy who really said the significant liberty was negative liberty, the leave me alone kind of liberty. But as you point out on the first page, he also said something else. He said, freedom for the wolves has often meant death to the sheep. Is that the theme of your book? Is it fair to say that's the theme of your book?
It's one of the themes of the book. And I was partly motivated by what happened during the pandemic, where many people said they don't want to wear masks or get vaccinated, and their freedom not to wear masks or not to get vaccinated was putting at risk other people's freedom to live. And economists think about trade-offs, and you think about the trade-off, which is more important, the little inconvenience of wearing a mask or the fundamental freedom of the right to live.
Right.
So that's really one of the big themes, the freedom of the gun owners to carry an AK-47 versus not only the freedom of those who are killed by the guns, but the fact that the freedom from fear of the children who today in schools all across the country have to have practices for what to do if a gunman enters the room. I mean, the kind of fear that...
Right. But now Tennessee just passed a law saying teachers can be armed in classrooms.
I mean, what that does to our society is just, I think, terrible. But I try to go beyond that notion to, you might say, a more positive, and in two ways. One, the freedom to flourish, the freedom to live up to your potential. And again, that entails trade-offs, because if you give somebody more resources, a poor kid an education, you have to fund that by taxes, and that's taking money away from somebody else, but there's a trade-off. And the question, how do you value that? And of course, I have my view, but I think it's really worthwhile realizing that by leaving that kid in poverty, you are really taking away his freedom. The people who are on the verge of starvation don't have any real freedom.
And our politics are really built on the notion that there are never any trade-offs. Politicians are always saying this is going to be good for everybody, and sometimes it's not good for everybody.
That's right. Now, there are some cases where you can make everybody better off. And my view, again, many on the right have not fully taken those cases on board when they take their very strong anti-regulatory stance. So a simple, obvious example is stoplights. Stoplights are a form of coercion. You can't go through the intersection until it's your turn.
Right.
You take turns. A little simple idea, taking turns. But in the absence of stoplights, in a city like New York, you would have gridlock. So nobody could move. So you'd be in a situation where nobody would have the freedom to move. You have stoplights, and then everybody has the freedom to move, but they have to take turns. So that's a sense in which a little coercion is actually freeing for everybody. And that basic idea actually extends across a much bigger landscape. So for instance, we wouldn't be here having this conversation probably if it hadn't been for government investment in the basic mRNA platform that led to the vaccines that were so important in dealing with COVID-19. Well, that's expanded our freedom, but that required taxation.
Right.
Because and that meant we had to have a little coercion. So again, you had a little coercion and a lot of freedom. And overall, I think all of us would say our overall freedom have been expanded.
You know, it's interesting you mentioned the COVID vaccine because I wrote a piece a couple of years ago about defending the deep state. And one of the people I interviewed was, is it Barney Graham? I think it's Barney Graham. He was an NIH scientist who basically invented the architecture for the vaccine, and he worked for the government. And it was largely unknown because I think most of American society, including most of the press, just can't conceive of the idea that the government would produce something as valuable as the structure for a vaccine.
That's right. I mean, the private sector did the last mile, you might think, or maybe the last tenth of a mile. But and even then, it was largely with government money. So it wouldn't have been able to do it on its own, at least not at the speed with which it had to be done.
Right. I want to ask you about economism, which is I don't know if you're familiar with that term. Since the Great Recession, we have seen a lot of criticism of the economics profession, and I would include your book as that. It's a lot of it derives from Carl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, where Polanyi said, "The individual should respect economic law even if it happened to destroy him. Nothing obscures our social vision as effectively as the economistic prejudice." And there have been a number of books by Michael Sandel, Elizabeth Pop Berman, Benjamin Applebaum, Robert Skidelsky, Angus Deaton had a recent book, and it seems to me your book is in this tradition of economists taking a step back and saying, the way economists have been thinking about these things has been wrong. We need to expand the factors that we take into account.
That's right. I mean, the way I put it, the way other economists have been looking at it is wrong. But actually, there has been a movement now for some time to try to expand that vision. I think the awareness that we have to live within our planetary boundaries has been a big push in that direction. When I was a member on the Council of Economic Advisors, I I started an initiative with the Department of Commerce to try to develop a green GDP and to try to bring in resource depletion and environmental degradation. And we knew we were on to something important when Congress threatened to take away all our money if we continued to do this. So, you know, we realized we weren't just geeks, that we were doing something significant. But then a little bit later, the president of France asked me to co-chair an international commission looking into the question of how do we broaden the way we think about economics and the way we measure it. It was a whole initiative. It's become a global movement, not so strong in the United States, but in other countries, called Beyond GDP, and trying to emphasize things that, you know, some of which I talk about in the book, about things like insecurity, inequality, that both you and I have written about, sustainability, you know, all the other aspects of well-being. And, you know, one of the aspects, obviously, that was brought to the fore by the pandemic is work-life balance.
I mean, your experience is different from a lot of economists in that you've been a practitioner. You've kind of gotten your hands dirty in this, which a lot of economists have not. And I can't resist. This is the nastiest but funniest thing I've ever heard said about economists, and it's from Robert Skidelsky, who was John Maynard Keynes' biographer, and he's quoting an economist I'd not heard of before named Eli Devens. And he said, if economists wished to study the horse, they wouldn't go and look at horses. They'd sit in their studies and say to themselves, what would I do if I were a horse? Is that a legitimate criticism?
To a large extent. I mean, we actually have criticisms that are even stronger. One of the things, if we didn't understand how a giraffe could get the blood all the way up so high, the conclusion would be that giraffes don't exist. Yeah, we do make fun of ourselves, but the fact is that way of reasoning is actually too prevalent within the economics profession.
I also want to turn to a criticism that you make, which is that the economics profession has been resistant to considering questions of distribution, which I think is true and also sort of astounding. And especially astounding was a quote that you dug up from the Nobelist Robert Lucas in 2004, who said, of the tendencies that are harmful to sound economics, the most seductive and, in my opinion, the most poisonous is to focus on questions of distribution.
Yeah, it's astounding. But it is still the case. He wrote that almost 20 years ago, and it's still the case that in most economics departments, in the basic graduate courses, there is no discussion of distribution. But the good news is change is happening, and it's slow. One of the realities that we have today is that we don't have a competitive economy. And one of the examples of the trade-offs of freedoms that I talk about in the book is the right to exploit versus the rights of the exploited. And one form of exploitation is exploiting market power. We need regulations to keep our economy competitive. Lena Khan at the FTC and the Department of Justice are fighting hard for that, but it has to overcome a half-century of judicial decisions that make it really hard to prevail, and it's going to take a lot of effort if we don't get new legislation through. So that the increasing evidence of market power plays a big role in the growth of inequality. And standard economists assume that markets are competitive.
Right.
And the same thing, one of the big changes that just happened in the last maybe 10 years is to understand also there is what we call monopsony power. Firms have market power over their workers. And while monopoly power leads to prices going up and exploiting consumers, monopsony power leads to wages going down and exploiting workers. And you get those two working together, and you get a lot of inequality in our society.
It seems that this book is really as much about power as it is about freedom. You talk about power as this kind of absent mechanism that again, the neoliberal economists don't sort of recognize. This is stunning to me as somebody who, I used to be a political reporter, and then I started writing about economics, and it is amazing to me that these kind of fundamentals of how power works are so seldom discussed in this context.
I mean, you're right. And I think it goes back to the realization that the neoliberal economic model that celebrated freedom for some, for the wolves, even if it meant a death for the sheep,
right.
Was an ideological agenda that was intended to allow businesses, corporations, to do what they want, including getting together and conspiring together and getting larger and larger and larger.
So you're saying Milton Friedman understood power quite well.
Yeah, and by assuming it wasn't there and would be taken care of automatically, he gave free scope to the corporations to exercise their power, both over consumers and workers. So it was a very, very clever strategy. I mean, you have to give him credit, even if it was a little bit dishonest. He was he got the Nobel Prize. He did some early work that was very good, but by the time I first met him in the 60s, he had already gravitated becoming basically an ideologue. I remember I gave a talk at the University of Chicago where I explained the idea that he was about to write a very famous article in New York Times Magazine. That's where academic publication by his sort does, about why firms should maximize shareholder value. And
focus on it to the exclusion of everything else.
To the exclusion, and it was almost a sin if they thought about anything else. If they worried about the environment, their customers, their workers, that was wrong. They should focus just on shareholder value maximization. So before he wrote that article, I had written a paper showing that that was not true. And that shareholder value maximization did not lead to the well-being of society. And so I gave the paper, and he said it's wrong. And I said, well, I did the squibbles and mathematics, and I said, where in my assumptions or in my analysis had I gone wrong? And our conversation went you're wrong. And we went around that for a little while, and then it was very clear this was not going to go anywhere. Now, he had the advantage. He wrote in the New York Times Magazine. I wrote in the Quarterly Journal of Economics. He got more readers. I have to say he won that.
I want to get nerdy for a moment and just sort of ask you about the word externality. And, can you explain to the audience what it is and how it affects freedom?
Yeah, so an externality is anything that happens where what I do has an effect on you. And there can be positive or negative externalities, but what I focus a lot on in the book is negative externalities. And that's the examples we've already talked about. Not wearing a mask means I could give you the disease, and that's a negative externality. You're worse off. I'm a little better off by not wearing a mask. You're a lot worse off. Pollution is the standard example of an externality,
right?
Where if we emit greenhouse gases, the atmosphere has an increasing concentration of greenhouse gases, and the whole Earth gets warmer. You face climate change with all the disastrous consequences. That's an externality.
But there could be positive externalities too, and you talked about that a little bit with the tragedy of the commons. People are not quite as evil as the mathematical formula makes them out to be. Can you describe that?
Well, there are many. One of the standard assumptions in economics is that individuals are both infinitely selfish and infinitely rational. And I think I joke in the book, but that the notion that people are infinitely selfish came to Friedman and many on the right by just introspection. But we're here in a synagogue, or what was a synagogue, and the whole point of religion is to try to imbue into individuals the notion that we are a community and that we ought to care about others. And,
and often do, I think, is the
what
point
I
of
was going to say,
the...
as parents, it's one of the things that we work hardest at, and we sometimes succeed.
Right. And there were commons that worked just fine because the community came together and said, you know what, if we all pursue our selfish interests, this isn't going to work.
Exactly.
And I believe somebody won a Nobel pointing that out. I forgot.
Eleanor Ostrom, who's one of those, she got a Nobel Prize in economics, the first woman, but she wasn't an economist. She was a political scientist.
Ah, interesting.
But remarkably, economists paid very little attention to her work. I once asked my class, how many of you know who, this is a PhD students, how many of you know the work of Eleanor Ostrom? And not a one raised their hand.
Wow. And again, she's not someone who went into her study to imagine what a horse would be like. She went out and saw what these communities in Europe did for 500 years.
Yeah, in Sri Lanka and India. Yeah, she asked the question, how do communities work together to address a scarcity of a shared resource like a lake?
Right. Which suggests it is possible that the global community will address climate change.
I hope so.
One of the more shocking things in your book, I was actually shocked, and I'm a liberal, was you said, there is no invisible hand.
So, yeah.
Can you elaborate?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, one of the Adam Smith's most famous lines was, the pursuit of self-interest leads as if by an invisible hand to the well-being of society. Now, let me parenthetically point out, Adam Smith didn't really believe that. he spends much of the rest of that book and much of his earlier book on the theory of moral sentiment explaining why you need regulations, particularly to protect workers. You need government investment in education. He didn't believe in free markets. In fact, he himself pointed out that businessmen seldom get together without colluding against the public interest. So
I also want to recite this fantastic quote you have, Adam Smith, on regulation. When the regulation is in support of the workmen, it is always just and equitable.
yeah.
That's shocking.
It is, and just to give you a little bit of a flavor of the way Adam Smith has gotten distorted over time, George Stigler, another University of Chicago economist who got a Nobel Prize again, came out with an edition of Adam Smith, a shortened version, where they deleted all that kind of... it was the pure version of what he wished Adam Smith had said, but it was very different from what Adam Smith had actually said. So it is quite remarkable. It's not, you're laughing, but it's not really laughable because it is what has indoctrinated, has become the Bible of many people on the right. So going back to your question, my own research, for which I got the Nobel Prize, was in part about what happens, how do economies work when there is imperfect information, and particularly what I call asymmetric information, which is just the situation where some people know something that someone else doesn't know, which is always. And what I showed and proved analytically was that whenever that is the case, or where there are imperfect risk markets, and always, the market is not efficient. And so the way I summarize these ideas is to say the reason that Adam Smith's invisible hand often seems invisible is that it's not there.
I wanted to carry forward your idea about coercion, which is another word for that is regulation. Regulation gets a very bad name, but it is a very important and necessary part of government.
I would go even further. It's a necessary part of life and regulation. We're here in a synagogue, the Ten Commandments, we're a set of regulation. Thou shalt not kill. That's a regulation. Thou shalt not steal. It took away the freedom of the thief. But there's a much more important freedom, the freedom not to have your property stolen. So, once we realized that was a very simple society where a limited number of regulations would do. We're in a 21st century economy. We need a lot more regulations to make our society function.
Even back in the 19th century, I just wrote a piece defending regulation, and I looked at a lot of the history, and I was very surprised to learn that I'd always thought of bucket brigades as this wonderful example of voluntarism. Bucket brigades weren't voluntarism. You got drafted into a bucket brigade, and when you stop and think about it, of course that's how it works. This house is on fire. You, pal, over here. There's no time to sort of call out for volunteers. So that's a principle that goes way, way back in our society.
That's right. And if you start thinking, going back to something I mentioned very briefly before, the absence of banking regulation led to the financial collapse in 2008, and has happened over and over again. Milton Friedman said that he was really concerned about economic freedom because it was necessary for political freedom. But that was a little bit of a charade because one of his favorite personalities was Pinochet in Chile. And as soon as Pinochet took office, he ran down there and started giving him his crackpot advice. And part of that was to take away all the bank regulation. And they had, quote, free banking. And you can guess what happened. Their banking system collapsed. It took them a quarter century to dig their way out of the hole of the debt that created, and it caused a very deep downturn. But it took, authoritarian figure to force that on the country. We deregulated voluntarily, and we got the same outcome. It took a little longer because we didn't do it as thoroughly, but the outcome was the same.
Another provocation in your book I wanted to mention is you say you don't think the Inflation Reduction Act, by extending subsidies, was the best way in order to encourage a green economy. Did I read that correctly?
Yes. Well, we need to move to a green economy, and the way the subsidies were given were fairly untargeted and inefficient. What we should have had, a bigger dose of regulations, no fossil fuel electric generation, moving all to electric cars like California is doing. Those kinds of simple regulations, not hard to see whether an electric generating plant is using coal or not. So very easy to implement. Combined with a price of carbon, you penalize somebody for using carbon. And then you have public investments in innovation, and you encourage private investment. So it's a broader package than relying just on subsidies.
And you had a very interesting progression you describe in the book where you say, well, okay, you give the subsidy, then instead of the company paying for switching to green technology, the taxpayer is paying for it, and then you spun it out a bit longer. I'm trying to remember how it went. It was a very interesting sequence.
What you want is firms to bear the full cost of what they're doing.
And explain why that's important.
Well, if you're subsidizing somebody, it's lowering the cost of their production below the true cost to society. And that's just not efficient. So you may need to help people make the transition. And in some cases, particularly with technology, you may need to help corporations make the transition. But the way we did it, the total cost of our subsidies are now estimated to be over $1 trillion. Now, it's been good because it's helped stimulate our economy. But from a global point of view, it's had another effect that I don't think we fully took on board. It's created an unlevel playing field, particularly with emerging markets and developing countries. And that's really important because most of the greenhouse gas emissions now are in the developing countries and the emerging markets. So we need their cooperation. But they aren't going to cooperate if they think we are not cooperating. And they see very strongly the IRA as an attempt to steal their jobs and to take advantage of, because they don't have the fiscal resources to engage in this.
Which this sort of leads to, I think, one of the most interesting parts of your book, and it's based on your own experience working on trade policy, is the way that sort of free and fair, what looks like free and fair trade is actually rigged for the wealthy countries and for corporations, and you end up with some crazy outcomes like third world countries, or even sort of second world countries like Mexico, first world countries like Mexico, not being able to clean up a toxic waste dump without getting sued for imposing on an investment. Can you tell us a little bit about the ways in which these rules are rigged towards the wealthier countries and to the wealthier corporations?
Yeah, there are many aspects. Let me just look at the outcome and then talk about how we succeeded in doing that, and talk about 2 or 3 examples of what I think of really toxic outcomes. One of them is that 70, 60 years after the end of colonialism, colonial patterns of trade still persist. That is to say, the developing countries are still producing primary goods, and the value added occurs in the advanced countries. And there are many ways by which this has been perpetuated. One of them is the way we structure the tariff. We had higher tariffs on more value-added goods from the developing countries. So we encourage them to export their raw materials, but we effectively punish them if they try to move up the value chain. Something else we did, and that comes back to the industrial subsidies, industrial policy that the United States has done in the context of the IRA. For 40 years, we told other countries they shouldn't do this. And developing countries said, we need to do this to close the gap between us. We said, no, you can't do that. It's not allowed. And that was another mechanism, deliberately, I think, meant to keep them down below. There's a very nice book by Ha-Joon Chang, an English economist, which is titled Kicking Away the Ladder. The idea is that U.S. and went up the ladder by having industrial policies. Many of the European countries did. But now that we're there, we say other countries can't do what we did. So those are a couple of the examples of the mechanisms by which this colonial trade pattern has persisted. One of the things that has become a real source of concern in, that you mentioned are these investment agreements where the country is told, if you sign this agreement, you'll get a foreign direct investment will come in. Didn't happen. But when they sign this agreement, they agree not to regulate, not to increase taxes, and that means when circumstances change, they can't do anything about it. Let me give you 2 examples. You mentioned one, which was a very famous one in Mexico, where an American company had a toxic waste dump right outside, right in the center of a city, and the city said, "We don't want toxic waste dump in the middle of the city," and so they banned it, and the company sued. These are called investor-state dispute. So they sued, and they won. And they had to pay a lot of money. Now, this is now coming back to bite the United States and Europe, because we thought this was really a way that we can tame the developing countries. But this kind of agreement was part of NAFTA. It was Chapter 11 in NAFTA. And a Canadian company sued the United States when we tried to stop the Keystone Project, the pipeline. And because they said, we have the right to build a pipeline. We made all this investment, and you can't stop us. But really interesting is that Europe, which is very much more committed to doing something about climate change than the United States is, they discovered that they had signed agreements like that. And so they were being sued by all kinds of companies as they adopt these regulations about not polluting, not emitting greenhouse gases. So all the European countries are being sued, and they've all agreed now to drop out of this agreement. But developing countries can't drop out so easily. And that's part of the asymmetry. There's one more aspect of these, what I call unfair trade, that came out very clearly during the pandemic, and that was that while in the initial foundation of the WTO, there was a provision on intellectual property that in the event of a pandemic, people could issue what is called a compulsory license, so that anybody in the country could produce the vaccine or the therapeutic or whatever the product was. The drug companies had found out ways of slowing down the process because they didn't want the drugs out there, because the longer the drug was not out there, the more monopoly profits they could get. Now, that was why somebody's shaking their head. You can't believe it, but it's true. So in the beginning of the pandemic, South Africa and India asked for a waiver of intellectual property rights. They said, we'll pay royalties, but we need to get access to the vaccines quickly. And people are dying.
Right.
And we don't want to go through all this, legal mechanisms. So we just give us a waiver, we'll pay you the royalties, and let our companies produce. And Pfizer and Moderna, who only had the vaccine because of U.S.
Because it was subsidized and also developed at NIH, right?
Said no. And a group of us, had a big movement, got President Biden to support the waiver of the vaccine, but there wasn't really a strong waiver of the therapeutics. We couldn't get Germany, UK, and Switzerland.
Wow.
And so what it developed was vaccine apartheid. We had as many vaccines as we wanted. Canada reserved 8 times the number of vaccines as the population. In Africa, you could hardly get a vaccine. And Pfizer and Moderna would say things like, they don't have the capacity to produce. And then you say, well, if they don't have the capacity to produce, let them try. And, you won't lose any profits if they can't.
Right.
So what's your concern? And in fact, they did have the capacity, both South Africa and India had the capacity. Finally, there was a license given in South Africa, but using a Freedom of Information Act in South Africa, Pfizer didn't want anybody to know the nature of the contracts they were signing. Using the Freedom of Information Act, finally we found out that part of the conditions of the agreement were that most of the vaccines produced in South Africa had to go to Europe or other advanced countries.
Wow.
And that part that went to South Africa, they had to pay a higher price than Europe was paying.
Oh, man.
I mean, some of this is almost unbelievable. But
You're right, there is no invisible hand. We've just barely touched the surface here, but we now, I think, are going to open it up to questions from the audience. And I think we have 2 mics up front. So if anybody would like to ask a question, please line up.
Hi, thank you. I haven't read the book, and this is the first time I've heard about you, but I'm on the email list for Six and I, and I was like, well, it sounds interesting. I kind of have an out there question, and I don't know if I'm totally like off base, but I've always felt like to really deal with the class divide in America, especially with neoliberalism and the economic policies, that I feel like I watch policymakers and politicians dance around the white supremacy piece and how that shores up the drive for neoliberalism, basically. Like, I've always had that instinct as a Gen Xer. Even when I was 15 and Reagan was in office, I was like, how come they're not talking about how this is really about, like, we don't want integration, anti-blackness, that sort of thing? And like, are those conversations now happening, at least like in the circles you're in, the people who actually make these policies? Because I feel like just saying it's just about white working class, white lower class people, like, that's just too simplistic. You know, they've been decimated by what's happened in the economy in the rural America. Like, these people are just tired and hungry. Like, I get why they support these leaders in the right. But if the people who have the influence aren't having these conversations behind closed doors, like, how is it going to change?
yeah, well, the question
It's really about power, getting back to the power.
Exactly what I was saying. It was really about that. And Gary Becker, who was another neoliberal economist teaching at University of Chicago, and if any of you know the University of Chicago, it's located in the middle of a ghetto. I mean, of a really very area where you can see the effects of discrimination. Mm-hmm. And he wrote a book on the economics of discrimination, saying that discrimination can't exist. and the reason, economic discrimination, because if it did, market forces would correct it. And
it was right beneath his nose.
Yeah, exactly. And to me, it was amazing. Mm-hmm. And it was really this belief in that the market was perfectly competitive, mm-hmm. and didn't recognize the importance of power in any form. Mm-hmm.
And it makes you wonder whether, to get back to your question, was he like Friedman? He must really have known that there was such a thing as racial discrimination in America.
He must have known, living there. That was the point. I mean, mm-hmm. how could you not understand that? I mean, mm-hmm. one of the reasons why I felt so intensely about these issues, I grew up in Gary, Indiana, mm-hmm. which was just not far from Chicago, and we saw it, all the time. Mm-hmm. And so it's really one of the things that drove me into economics, seeing that so visibly. Mm-hmm. And in terms of the tools of economics, one of the big changes over the last 40 years has been the development of what's called game theory, mm-hmm. which is a mathematical way of actually analyzing power and how it plays out.
Mm-hmm. Next question, please. Oh, I'm sorry, over there. Yes, sorry.
Would you consider Bill Clinton a neoliberal?
Mostly.
And please explain why.
Okay. So, the cabinet in the Clinton administration was very interesting because we had people like Bob Reich, who was a close friend of Bill Clinton from his Oxford days, Secretary of Labor, And he in no way was a neoliberal. I mean, he was very concerned about inequality, written some very powerful pieces about inequality. He was concerned about the issues of power. He didn't believe that, he thought there was an important role for unions. So he was not a neoliberal. I wouldn't view myself as neoliberal. The chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, when I wasn't there before me, and the head of the NEC, Laura Tyson, was not really a neoliberal. She'd written her PhD thesis on Yugoslavian co-ops, so she was, a really very different mindset. But overall, in the end, the administration wound up reflecting a lot of neoliberalism. The most important aspect of that was financial sector deregulation. And they pushed trade liberalization without adequate thinking about the long-term consequences, both on individuals and our economy. Individuals in terms of moving, the adverse effect of those who lost their jobs. Our economy in terms of the lack of resilience, the fact that in the pandemic we couldn't even make masks, protective gear, let alone more sophisticated products. So we lost our industrial capacity. And
They also they also didn't regulate derivatives, which was also an important
that's right.
decision.
And it was so clear. In fact, one of the pieces of deregulation was the piece of legislation that said we won't regulate. Derivatives cannot be regulated.
Which was a reaction against someone, Brooksley Born, who actually wanted to regulate derivatives.
Exactly. Yeah.
Next question.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here, Dr. Stiglitz, and hear you. I just got the book, so I'm sorry if some of this is actually explained here. I love hearing about different ways of thinking about economic theory, but I was shocked actually to hear you say that there's no invisible hand. So I would like to ask, because I understood that someone else's well-being can also be incorporated in your utility function, and the work-life balance issues can be included in the supply of labor function, and also the kind of dichotomy between like sustainability issues within environment also, because more and more consumers are demanding greener and greener products. It can be actually also, it's not necessarily in conflict with profit maximizing and the shareholder value, and definitely not in conflict with economic growth. So I kind of don't think that the conclusion there is that there is no invisible hand. I mean, there are things that we don't see, and yet they are there, like God, for example. So I can't believe that you wouldn't have heard some criticism regarding this, so I would just like to hear what your response is to this. And really, if it's in the book, I apologize, but I'd just like to hear that.
And if I understand you correctly, you're basically saying, can these social factors be plugged into a market model?
Exactly, and sure, I mean, sure, with the environmental stuff, of course, you have to have taxes and subsidies, but subsidies. But it doesn't mean that it's like beyond GDP. It's in there. It can be incorporated in what we have right now.
Yeah.
Right.
So there are two separate aspects of this. Can we create an economy that deals with these issues of sustainability, inequality, life-work balance? Yeah, I think we can. And in fact, the last third of my book is about the alternative to neoliberal capitalism, which I call progressive capitalism. If we were in Europe, we would probably talk about it as a rejuvenated social democracy. That in that progressive capitalism, there is going to be an array of institutional arrangements, of which for-profit companies are only one part.
Right.
There are co-ops, NGOs. This institution is an example of that. We're moving, the manufacturing, which is the way we always used to think about economy, is only about 10% of the economy, less than 10%, both in GDP and employment. The service sector is really the largest part of the economy, and increasingly the service sector is the care economy. Care economy caring for the young, for healthcare, education, and the elderly. And one of the things we've learned is that in many aspects of the care economy, for-profit doesn't work very well.
Right.
You take somebody with dementia in an old age home, they are a prime candidate for exploitation.
Right.
And
you've got hedge funds buying these retirement homes. You've got hedge funds even buying hospices. I mean, most hospice care is for profit now.
And then you ask, do you feel comfortable being in that situation and being exploited? And my own feeling is it's so much better to have somebody whose objective is caring rather than making profits off of me.
Right, right.
And so the framework that I would argue for it needs to be a much more inclusive, a much more expansive framework in which for-profit firms are a part.
Right.
But even then, when we come for profit, we're going to need regulations. We're going to need taxes. They can't be unfettered. And so they're going to play an important role, and we can shape it. But it will take a different kind of economy than the neoliberal.
Right.
framework.
One of the interesting terms that's come into play recently is this term pre-distribution.
Yeah. So that when you're dealing with inequality, we recognize that the rules of the game make a big difference. We've talked before about monopoly power, about worker bargaining power. By changing the rules, you change the distribution.
Right.
The distribution of market income. And if you have a more equal market income distribution, you have less burden on redistribution.
Right. And that's capitalism. It's just a more equitable form of capitalism.
Exactly. And every economy has rules. And the real question is, what are those rules? And how do you shape those rules? Who shapes them?
Next question.
Hi, Dr. Stiglitz. Thank you so much for coming here. You're one of my favorite economists of all time, so I'm absolutely starstruck. I'm what you would consider Gen Z. We are currently facing a lot of issues throughout the world, such as the issue in Palestine, due to the DRC, the Congo. We see Southeast Asia's flooding, and it feels like for a lot of us, there's a lot of hopelessness coming from that. And what would you recommend for us moving forward? What would be those rules? And I'm sure you explain it in the last third of your book, but what would you expect, what would you like for us as Gen Z to do, and as Gen Z economists as well moving forward? What should we study? What should we be doing?
Well, I think the most important aspect is going to be political engagement. Because I think it's only, the rules are set in a political process. That's part of the common, what we share. And it's important for individuals in their own behavior to reflect on the externalities, on the effects that one has on others. But in the end, and that can make a very big difference. You know, and I do a lot of preaching to corporations. I'll give you one example. I used to go to Davos every year, and where all the muckety mucks come together, and they go to one session of well-intentioned corporate leaders, and we would talk about a lot of these issues, including inequality, and they all were very earnest. And then one year, one of the CEO of one of the big companies came in, and he said he basically had an epiphany, and he had realized that 40% of his workers were getting paid below a livable wage. And, you know, I thought I'd been preaching this for years and years, and he was talking about inequality, but he never did any introspection. And after that, he raised all the wages of all his workers. It didn't cost him that much. It was a little bit change in the bottom line.
Wow.
But he felt a lot better about himself and about his corporation.
That's the only story I've ever heard about anything good coming out of Davos. I think we have time for just one more question.
Yeah, we can take two more, one from each microphone.
Oh, okay,
Thank you.
okay.
Thank you for being here tonight, Dr. Stiglitz. Inherent in the book seems to be this theme that the perception of freedom has been sort of co-opted by powerful interests. In information economics, there is this idea of perfect information, that if we know enough, we will arrive at the optimal outcome. Increasingly in our society, it seems that our information is determined by a powerful group. So you see this in Google search results, when the top are those who can pay to be at the top. How does economics need to develop to respond to that asymmetry in who is providing us information, and how do you think it will impact our world?
Yeah, that's a great question. I spent a lot of time in the book talking about that. It doesn't mean that I got the answer. But I think, and it goes back a little bit to the issue of power. One of the things I emphasize is that one aspect of this is who gets to set the meta-narrative. It's not only the specific things, you know, that goes at the top when you do a search of what kind of pet food do you want to buy, or what kind of, where you want to take a vacation. It goes really to the overall story about how our economy functions. Fox News, the Wall Street Journal can propagate an idea that free markets are going to deliver, and if you go away from that, they can instill a sense of fear that the whole system will come collapsing down. And so one of the things that I think is particularly dangerous about the neoliberal order, in a way, was that it allowed anybody with money to buy control of the main ways by which we get news. And now, the social media. You have Musk, Zuckerberg, really controlling the norms of what is acceptable and what is not, what lies get transmitted, what doesn't, with misinformation and disinformation. And we understand how dangerous it is when it's a foreign company like TikTok. And we say, we don't like that, they're interfering, but I don't feel that much more comfortable with Musk and Zuckerberg.
Right, right.
You know, it's not a national security concern, but it's a concern about the nature of our society. So I think one of the things that we have to do is to begin to have regulations and public investments that redefine, you might say, the information space. Europe has done, again, a better job than we have on that by, they passed something called the Digital Services Act, DSA, the Digital Marketing Act, to try to get more competition in this space. More concerned about privacy, AI and ethics. They've really tried to, I don't think they've gone far enough, but at least they've begun that kind of discussion. We haven't begun that. But the other thing that they've done, I think that has been quite successful in a few countries, I don't want to say everywhere, is public media. So the Swedish television, everybody knows about BBC. And what's striking about that is that they've been able to create independent agencies supported by government that have been immune from politics, increased trust not only in the media, but also in government and in society more generally. They've been really successful institutions. And, you know, if they can do it, I think we can too.
Final question.
No pressure. Maybe just as a follow-up to the young lady before me, but I was just perusing your book before the discussion here, and you say that a little coercion is necessary for collective action. And I work for the Utah Education Association, affiliate of the National Education Association, and we're about collective action for the common good, and trying to do that for many years, and to fight against things like vouchers and the denigration of public education as a common good. Well, could you amplify on that about coercion for being necessary for collective action?
Yeah, what I meant by that was really very, very, very simple. That collective action for the kinds of public investments that we need for research, investment, education, needs public support. You know, economists say the elementary principle, no free lunch. And that means you have to raise taxes. Taxes, most people don't pay their taxes voluntarily. You know, we do it in some sense voluntarily, but I mean, behind it is a certain degree of coercion. But what's interesting, and some statistics I cite in the book, is that in some countries, people are actually very happy about paying their taxes. Why? Because they realize that without that, they wouldn't have all these public goods. And they're happy about contributing to being a contributing member of society. That and those who are richer are happy that they can contribute more. It's not, you know, and that's part of, again, the neoliberal doctrine was to sort of say government was always wasteful, taxes are always bad. You know, that kind of myth is just not true. The government is sometimes wasteful, but so is the private sector. Nobody wasted resources on the scale of our that occurred in our private banking system before 2008. I mean, that was massive waste. You know, building shoddy houses in the middle of the Nevada desert. I mean, I could go on, but yes, government waste. You know, everybody's fallible.
Right.
But we are all benefited from not only the vaccine we talked about, but from the internet. That was a result of government investment.
Right.
And where would we be today without the internet? It would be a different world that we live in. So, in a way, people forget what we get from the government.
Right. It's very much like the classic cry you hear from that members of Congress hear from constituencies is "keep the government's hands off of my Medicare."
Yeah, I actually heard that. I went to my high school, my 55th high school reunion in Gary, Indiana, and there was one guy there who stood up and said, I want government to keep its hand not only off my Medicare, but also off of my Social Security. And another member of our class, this was 2015, before the arrival of Trump. And I saw in Gary, Indiana, all these forces coming together another guy said, the only reason you're able to live in your retirement is because of government.
Right, right. And I don't know if you read Michael Lewis's book a few years ago about government workers, where he told a fantastic story about some agriculture undersecretary who went to a small town to hand out a check for economic development in this small town, and the mayor pulls him aside before the ceremony and says, can you do me a favor? Can you say, when you announce this contribution, can you avoid saying that it came from the federal government? Well, with that, thank you so much. And
Thank you so much to Dr. Stiglitz and Timothy Noah. Thank you all for joining us. There are additional books